Hello everyone, and you're very welcome to our webinar on construction business risk in Ireland and the UK post-Brexit. Today is the start of the EU summit, and today is also the deadline to get a post-Brexit deal done, or Boris Johnson said the UK will walk away. So here to discuss the legal ramifications of Brexit for the UK and Irish construction markets are Jamie Ritchie, partner at LK Shields, and Blake Morgan, Richard Wade partner at Blake Morgan. Just before we start the presentations, if I can ask if anyone has any questions, if you can look at the box on the right-hand side of your screen and put in the questions, and we'll cover those at the end. So now let me hand over to Jamie. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, and it's really quite something to be able to speak here today at what is a unique deadline day webinar. We are obviously all continuing to monitor the ongoing developments with the Brexit negotiations, and who knows, there may be some updates during the course of today's discussions. However, for the most part today, I'm going to talk about the impact of a no-deal scenario on the Irish construction economy at large. In 2019, the Construction Industry Federation in Ireland ran a survey of its members, and that survey concluded that a majority of those same members believe that construction costs were going to increase somewhere between 5 and 10% as a result of a no-deal scenario. Now, Irish contractors have been acutely aware of the potential risks posed by Brexit for a significant period of time now, and they have been taking action as a result, and that is in no small measure due to the excellent work of organisations such as our hosts here today in Enterprise Ireland. But what about UK companies, UK construction companies, manufacturers and suppliers, those companies that may, for example, not have been involved in Irish projects in the past, but are looking to the future and considering the significant suite of infrastructure projects that are on the horizon over the next number of years? What actions can they take? Well, we know that the UK has left the European Union, and come the end of the negotiated transition period, on the 1st of January 2021, there are going to be some fairly significant challenges which UK companies will have to overcome. So this is really what my section of the webinar is about. I'm probably talking to an audience more of UK contractors, giving you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the actions you can take now in order to protect your commercial position going forward and pipeline, but also giving you a little bit of a flavour of what you can expect to see within the Irish market going into 2021 and beyond. My friend and colleague Richard Wade from Blake Morgan will also be speaking after me in relation to a similar comparative analysis of the UK market's position. Luke, if you could move on to the first slide, please. So what actions can UK contractors take now? Well, it helps really to do this with reference to what we have been seeing in the market, what sort of actions Irish contractors have been taking. So first and foremost, when Brexit occurred, where we saw it as construction lawyers in the first instance was really contractually, through contractual mechanisms. I encountered it really through negotiations with funders. Funders were looking at the apportionment of risk more generally and had decided that Brexit clauses were something that should be included in construction contracts. So that's something that we saw very early doors. Brexit clauses effectively mitigate risk for Brexit delay, Brexit cost increases. And what I'm talking about here really is delays to materials and the impact that that can have on a project. Now, these clauses have become more and more refined as time has gone on, and they have become more stringent. I don't expect those clauses to disappear just because the transition period has ended come the 1st of January 2021. They will continue to be around for a period of time. So the important thing to note is that if you are coming into the market, that these clauses exist and also that you should be seeking advice about how to back those clauses, particularly if you're a main contractor accepting this risk from an employer that's been placed downstream on you. The other major action that contractors coming into the market should be looking at is getting what's described as an economic operator's registration and identification number, an EORI. Now, an EORI effectively is a common customs reference. It's required if you're involved in importing goods into Ireland. You can get it from applying through the Irish Revenue's website, and it's a relatively straightforward process. However, it's an essential requirement if you are importing goods. There is a number of publications available on the Irish government's website about how you go about getting an EORI, but to date, the uptake has been quite positive. There's been 67,000 Irish businesses as of the 14th of September 2020, which have registered for an EORI. So that accounts for roughly 90% of all companies involved in import-export as between the UK and Ireland. Customs duties will be payable on all goods coming into to Ireland going forward. It's important, therefore, that you take the appropriate steps to take advice on how that is done, and the processes for filling in the various elements of paperwork. The usual situation that we're finding now is that much of this work is typically outsourced to a third-party agent. If you are going to do it in-house, then there are quite significant hurdles that you have to overcome. But usually this is done through an agent. Additionally, VAT in the event of a no deal scenario will also be payable going forward after the end of the transition period, so 21%. At least until the February 2021. So what a lot of Irish companies and UK companies that have come into the Irish market have done is they have set up a deferred payment account with the Irish Revenue, which has helped alleviate some of the issues that they've been encountering, and that also applies in the context of customs duties. Another issue which probably hasn't been spoken about as much is procurement. There are going to be quite significant challenges potentially in the procurement sphere. At the moment, by virtue of, well, certainly by virtue of the EU membership up to the start of this year and the transitionary arrangements, the UK remains on all fours, and as far as we know, come 1st of January 2021, they will also be on all fours in a procurement sense. However, the future relationship depends on equivalency, and really the UK is going to be a third country for procurement purposes, which places obstacles in itself in terms of how UK companies tender within Ireland, which matters because a lot of the major construction projects going forward for the next 20 years, particularly in light of Project Ireland 2040, the Irish government's 116 billion euro plan to deliver infrastructure over the next 20 years. Those projects, the lion's share of them are going to be public contracts. So it's important to take appropriate steps. Now, the UK government has indicated its intention to sign up to the agreement on government procurement, the WTO's agreement, which will alleviate some of those issues and allow access. But still, in its status as a third country, there are going to be certain restrictions, particularly in areas like utilities. And when you look at the suite of projects in Project Ireland 2040, particularly things like interconnectors and major other utility projects, that could place barriers in the way. So there are things that UK contractors, actions that they have taken to date. For example, many UK contractors have set up a base in Ireland and are carrying out work in order to build up that kudos within this jurisdiction and experience. Another thing that I'll come to later in the talk is also the construction industry register, which might be something that the UK contractors should be looking at going forward. In terms of supply chain issues, well, I think this is a point that has been laboured quite significantly over the last few years. Over 40% of goods, construction goods coming into Ireland sorry, 40% of all construction goods coming into Ireland come from the UK. So that sort of highlights and emphasises the importance of this. A lot of UK EU notified bodies are going to, products that are registered with those bodies are going to have to be re-registered in Ireland or with one of the EU member 27 states through an accredited body, and the Irish accreditation board is considered to be the first port of call for any queries in that regard. Interestingly as well, we've noticed some developments in terms of the governing law clauses, choice of law and jurisdictional issues, particularly in regards to cross-border contracts. Typically, Richard will be able to attest to this as well, but the law of England and Wales has typically in international commercial contracts been one of the choice, the main choice for international contracts for many years. However, we've started to see that in cross-border arrangements where there's a UK and an Irish interest, there's been a trend moving towards Irish governing law. And there's a number of reasons for that. One being that there won't be an EU appeals mechanism in the background if it's a contract governed by the laws of England and Wales. But also it concerns reciprocal judgments. There are ongoing negotiations with that. Now, the UK has indicated its intention, a bit like in the procurement sphere, to accede to the Hague Convention on Choice of Courts, which will mitigate some of these issues in reciprocal arrangements and recognition of judgments. However, there is a slight risk that local courts in the EU, if they are looking at UK judgments, will intend to apply local rules over those of UK rules. So we just have to watch that space. If you can move on to the next slide, Luke. So in terms of the contractual framework in Ireland, well, these are really the main contracts. You'll recognise a few if you're a UK contractor, because they are the main forms that are used. The NEC and the JCT are quite prevalent in Ireland now, particularly in some of the larger projects. But I'll start with the RIAI contract. This is probably the most widely used form in all of Ireland. There are two forms. There is the yellow form and there is the blue form. The yellow form includes quantities as part of the contract. The blue form does not, and that is the sole difference between the two. They're based largely on the old RIBA contracts. They're designed to be straightforward and easy to use. We would see them used predominantly on private sector projects, and the larger the project, the more these contracts tend to be amended, particularly if you have third-party funders involved or institutional investors. The public works contract is the main government form of contract, and it's used widely on public projects throughout Ireland. It is quite, or it's got a name for itself rather, as being quite an onerous contract. It has over the years developed into having a more balanced apportionment of risk between the parties. But if you are tendering for works in Ireland and you are looking at public contracts, you need to become familiar and take advice on the issues surrounding the public works contract. It is mandated for use on public projects. However, in certain scenarios, other types of contracts can be used. And I mean, we would typically expect to see the likes of the NEC contract or some form similar to that being used for the likes of, say, Project Metro, which is the underground link between Dublin Airport and St Stephen's Green, which is on the horizon. FIDIC is the main form of contract used predominantly within the renewable sphere. Next slide, please, Luke. So just very briefly, in terms of the statutory framework here, we have what's known as Construction Contracts Act 2013. It came into effect back in 2016 and applies to all contracts after that date. However, some people would say it's quite similar to the Housing Grants and Construction Regeneration Act in the UK. However, there are some subtle differences. It does relate to minimum payment terms within construction contracts. That being said, with its adjudication process, there are some slight differences. You're allowed to adjudicate, but it's only in connection with a payment dispute. And unfortunately, the Act itself doesn't go on to define what a payment dispute is. So there's a lot of speculation and indeed legal commentary about what is a payment dispute in that context. And it'll be really interesting to see. I'm aware of at least one judgment that's going through at the moment, which will be released hopefully not in the too distant future, which will deal with adjudication and its applicability in Ireland. There was a bit of a slow uptake. There were 37 adjudications last year, or 37 applications rather, to bring adjudication last year, and there were 54 this year. So it's a trend going only in one direction. And in a post-COVID environment, I could certainly see there being, a lot more usage of it. The building control regulations is well, it's effectively a system for setting up certification for projects here in Ireland, and it involves the appointment of an assigned certifier and a design certifier, very similar to the concept of an approved inspector in the UK. And then we have the safety regulations, which are effectively our equivalent of the CDM regs over in the UK. Once again, there is an appointment for a project supervisor design process, which is before the project gets commenced and carries through the project, and then a project supervisor construction stage that deals with the construction elements. Usually this is the contractor, but not in every case. And then I've just mentioned the Health Preservation, Protection and Other Emergency Measures in the Public Interest Act. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that is the legislation that relates to COVID, which has recently come in, and that is where, or how, I should say rather, the restrictions take effect. So we've been consistently referencing COVID-19 in our contracts, and including COVID clauses now, which operate quite similarly to Brexit clauses. Frankly, they again apportion risk downstream for COVID delay, and we've seen in many cases that parties are entering into side agreements on ongoing projects where they agree to a certain amount of delay, they agree to a certain amount of cost increase, but then what happens is that they agree that future risk in relation to COVID-19 is effectively waived. Next slide, please, Anne. So just very briefly, a bit of a snapshot of the industry here. The market was extremely buoyant coming up to just before the pandemic. You can see there the figures were pretty eye-watering, even for a jurisdiction the size of Ireland. It was estimated that it was going to increase to 41 billion, the total construction output by 2023. Now there is going to be an increase in construction output, particularly because of Project Ireland 2040, but for this year, it's likely to fall into 17.9 billion roughly. That's down from 26 billion in 2019 because of all the disruption caused by COVID. But it's not a bad figure, and that the market is likely to recover quite quickly. Taking out Project Ireland 2040 for a moment, private sector growth areas continue to be, well, there's the data center market. There's 53 data centers in Ireland, and it accounts for the largest hold in terms of the data center market in all of Europe. Interestingly, the only country prior to this year who had more data centers in their jurisdiction was actually the UK. There's major investment of housing. There's 550,000 houses planned over the next 20 years. 9,500 confirmed 2 days ago in the budget are going to be built next year. Telecoms projects are very active. There's a lot of soft infrastructure around, and contractors and developers from Ireland who are on this webinar today will understand what I'm talking about. Care home, student accommodation, and that's very much an active market. However, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out post the pandemic. Warehousing and logistics is very much a major focus at the moment. Renewable energy, well, there's the 22 billion euro government action plan, which will be focused in on that. And I mean, it's almost a separate talk in its own right. There's a lot of investment going on there, and that will be will keep construction and energy lawyers busy for quite some time to come. And then the mainstay of the Irish economy really over the last few years has been foreign direct investment, pharmaceutical and manufacturing, particularly from the US. Next slide, please, Luke. So that's just a snapshot of the highlights. The big ones you can see there are really the DART upgrade and the Metro project. The Metro project is the one that is sort of on everybody's lips at the moment. It was slated for construction in, I think it was Q1 2021. Now COVID has had a significant impact on that, and it's going to be delayed. But they're looking to apply for a railway order in 2021, or approved a railway order in 2021, which will make a significant difference in terms of its development. But you can see just throughout all of that, there are major infrastructure projects going on, particularly in transport. There's the M20 Limerick to Cork motorway. There's the ring road in Galway. There's major projects announced in the budget in Donegal and Sligo. So I'm just going to leave that for the moment and just quickly move on because I'm conscious of time. Luke, do you want to move on to the next slide there? So generally speaking, in Ireland, there are what I would describe to be slightly more stringent requirements on projects. UK clients typically observe this themselves. So I think it's mindful. It would be important for UK companies, if they're coming into the market, to be mindful of this and to seek advice where appropriate. There's particularly issues in relation to insurance. We've seen a swing from each and every PI insurance over to aggregate PI insurance very recently. I suspect that the insurers are now tightening their belts in terms of the amount of risk they're willing to undertake. Next slide, please, Luke. So, as I said, in terms of an outlook, project pipeline is relatively buoyant. Insurers are taking on less risk. There is a focus on essential projects going forward, and I think that will be for a while now as we continue to live with these restrictions. I mentioned earlier the construction industry register in Ireland. I would recommend to anyone that is looking to do work in Ireland, they get registered with them. It's basically a badge of competency for contractors who are doing work here, and I'm starting to see it in construction contracts that it is a requirement that contractors are members. It's possible also in the future that this could become a mandatory register, so really you have to be mindful of that. Luke, if you want to move on to the final slide there. So this will probably come into the discussion that Richard and I are going to have at the end of this talk. We're going to try and allocate a good amount of time to questions, but will there be a deal? Well, I think we all hope so. My take on it is that we're at a stage now where we're probably looking at a series of mini deals that will be in areas of strategic cooperation and be packaged together to make it look like it's an actual complete deal. But in any event, it is incumbent on companies who haven't, particularly in the UK, who haven't got ready to really take appropriate steps. The relationship between the UK and Ireland has been described as an interwoven one. That's not just the case in terms of business, it's in terms of families and relationships. And whatever happens, I think a point that has been lost in the negotiations is that the common travel area will remain in place. It's always been around, and the right to live, work and access services in the CTA will be protected regardless of the outcome of Brexit negotiations. That's pretty much it from me. Luke, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. It's much appreciated giving us the insights in all the projects that's coming up in Ireland. So now if I can hand over to you, Richard. As I said, we'll cover any questions that are coming in at the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne, and thank you, Jamie, for that very comprehensive run through. And a lot of that will be of great interest, I think, to a number of businesses based in the UK, and in particular those who have had the foresight to look at what post-transition means, and in particular those who've been astute enough to take out Irish passports or other EU passports in order to maintain continuity, which has been something of an area of interest. I'm going to take a similar approach to that which Jamie has taken, which is very much a whistle stop tour through the situation in the UK, and I think it'll become apparent that there is quite a degree of similarity, as Jamie alluded to. Obviously, in the sort of 15-20 minutes I've got, it's only going to be pretty high level. So, Luke, if you can move on to the first slide, please. Thank you. So the intention is just to run through what the legal framework is and how this does apply to the construction sector. I'll touch briefly on how Irish businesses, or indeed any a business that doesn't otherwise have a base in the UK, can establish that presence. And then the main part of what I want to look at is actually how risk is dealt with. I mean, this is what runs through the vast majority of our daily working lives, and in terms of how construction risk is either allocated or shared on projects. And Brexit obviously brings a whole host of new elements and specific elements to that. And so following on from that, how claims might arise and might be dealt with. And finally, just to touch on the role that the government has taken in relation to overseeing, regulating. We can't ignore the COVID word, I'm afraid, although that's very much not the focus of this morning, but there are some significant degrees of overlap in terms of the risks that are being faced by businesses within the construction sector, and in particular the impact on supply lines, and in particular time for performance and quality and money. Luke, thank you. Next slide, please. So very briefly, I mean, the legal framework is going to look familiar. It's a mixture of statutory and other legislative framework and common law. But within the construction world, we're very much talking about applied contract, and the degree of regulation is fairly limited in terms of how it impacts on the construction sector. If you wanted to have a snapshot as to why that is, you'd only have to look at how the Construction Act came about, and the degree of consultation that arose in the 90s prior to the original Act coming on the books, and then when it was amended some 10-12 years later. There is a whole spectrum of views, obviously, in such a large industry, but the general consensus is actually we are large enough and grown up enough to be able to look after our own house. So the degree of regulation and interference should be kept to a minimum. Obviously, different views depending upon where in the supply chain anybody sits. The Act very much, and it's interesting to hear the parallels with what's happened in Ireland, but in the UK, the Construction Act does touch upon two main areas, which are the imposition of payment terms, which is quite prescriptive for a largely self-regulating industry, and then specifically looking at how disputes are dealt with. It was very interesting to hear the stats in what's happened with adjudication, and that they're on the up, which is what you would expect. Adjudication now, we've had it since 1998 in the UK. I think it's largely seen as being the default mechanism and the sort of the first stop shop for resolving the vast majority of disputes that do arise. And obviously in the UK it covers not just payment disputes, but it's open to any dispute that arises out of performance of construction operations. So the Construction Act is the main area in which we have seen external government interference into otherwise free negotiation of terms. Obviously, we do have a number of implied terms that will will be woven into any construction contract covering matters such as satisfactory quality, fitness for purpose, etc. And of course, there is the regulatory framework covering health and safety, and boy, we've all become experts in health and safety in ways which we couldn't have anticipated 12 months ago, and the way in which that has impacted upon construction sites. And I think that's going to be a common area wherever you are in the world, frankly. And then there are specific issues of the regulatory framework, and of particular relevance in the context of Brexit is what's happening with the change of regime, moving from the CE mark over to what is going to be the new regime, which is the conformity assessed mark. We will talk about that in probably in the panel discussion, but the intention is that the UK is going to be moving to a different, but it is to be hoped an aligned set of rules which will ensure consistency of product regulation, and we hope not just in that area but right across the board that I suppose the fault lines are going to be kept very much to a minimum. Jamie talked about tax, and of course that's a very large part of the regulatory framework in the UK, and the scheme that exists in the UK is one with which anybody that's coming in as a new player would have to be familiar with or familiarise themselves with, in terms of signing up and being part of the construction industry scheme, which deals with payment of tax at source. But of course, that's it's one of the certainties of life, and any business that is looking to set up is not just going to need the legal, but also the accounting advice that would enable proper compliance in that respect. And then of course EU law, which is still with us and will remain until the end of the transition period, but there will be elements that are likely to carry over beyond the 31st of December. It's one of the great, we talked beforehand, we're going to try and keep the politics out of this, but it is one of the great fallacies of the notion that the UK would be taking back control in terms of thinking, well, that's it, once we're out of the EU, we're out of the EU. It was never going to be that straightforward, and particularly in terms of the markets in which businesses are going to be competing. Jamie touched on it by talking about the procurement regime, and that is inevitably going to carry on in some way, shape or form, I think, in terms of contracts that UK businesses are going to be interested in looking to compete for, as indeed are state aid rules. They are not simply going to disappear overnight, would be my bold prediction. Thanks, Luke. Can we have the next slide, please? So, very briefly, and this it may well be familiar territory, so I'll rush through this, but there are various ways in which a business presence can be established in the UK. The intention behind this slide is to highlight that there is a great degree of flexibility, and it's not a sort of a one-stop shop, but it could be a minimal presence that any overseas business is looking at establishing. Acquisition of existing companies, I suspect it could be a matter, something of great interest. We are going through a period of such enormous change at the moment that is throwing up a number of very interesting opportunities. So I would expect that that's going to be quite an attractive proposition for any player that is going to look to establish a presence. I think the rest of them will speak for themselves, and I suspect the incorporation of an SE within the EU is probably not going to be of huge relevance to anybody on this call, but it's going to become obviously less of a major part of the landscape in the UK after the end of December. Thanks, Luke. If we can move on. So. how do we deal with risk? Luke has touched upon JCT and NEC, which are the two main forms of procurement within the UK. JCT is still far and away the most popular route, but NEC is growing in popularity, particularly in relation to public sector contracts, and a lot of the big infrastructure projects are being let on NEC forms. As many of you will be aware, NEC is largely set up as a collaborative form of contract, with the idea that the package of risk is taken and is shared between the parties, and the focus on dealing with issues that might arise out of those risks is very much one of discussion, collaboration, cooperation, and trying to find a solution. JCT has been with us for a lot longer, and he's very much adversarial in nature, and it's about risk apportionment. I'll talk in a few minutes about the attitudes that are being adopted at the moment, certainly on the sort of the employer contractor axis, but because JCT still accounts for roughly 4/5 of construction projects in the UK, there is still very much a philosophy of taking the risk and allocating it rather than sharing it. The other forms are on there just by way of sort of mentioning, and I make a reference to BIM because there have been some suggestions which are interesting. I'm not sure they're necessarily practical as to whether BIM might take over contracting completely, but I think we're still quite a long way off that. Thanks, Luke. Next slide, please. And of course, within those methods, there are different ways of allocating the risk. It's probably best actually if we look at the following slide, Luke, if you can flick through to that, because it talks about these different procurement routes, but puts it in a more graphic representation in terms of clients adopting more of the risk under prime cost and management forms, but with the package deals, turnkey projects, design and build, and imposing that risk on contractors. That has been growing in popularity over the last 20 years or so. Design and build has become a very popular procurement route particularly for clients that are not serial purchasers of construction projects. So that obviously is less likely to impact on the big infrastructure projects. Thanks, Luke. We'll just move on. That's really just by way of a background and illustration. So, three main areas of risk that we're talking about in the context of Brexit is harmonisation of standards, regulations, movement obviously of materials and products, and how smoothly that's going to operate. And then finally, and it's an issue that is common to both Ireland and the UK, is workforce and skills and planning for the future. And the fact that I think we both anticipate that it's going to be a seller's market for the next few years, and there's a real lesson in that for clients who are looking ahead as to how they're going to procure their projects. Thanks, Luke. Next slide, please. So within just taking those three areas briefly, in terms of standards and regulations, I mentioned about implied terms, the question of quality of materials. I don't think there's any suggestion that any client is going to look to compromise on quality, but it's a question of whether materials are going to be able to comply with the relevant standards. Statutory requirements and building regulations is a particularly important topic at the moment in the UK. Everybody is sort of waiting to see what's going to come out of the second part of the inquiry on Grenfell, which is a major examination of how building regs are able to cope with materials and standards, and we may see a greater degree of regulation. I think this notion of there being freedom to set regulations, it's coming into other areas outside construction. Food standards in particular is getting a lot of attraction, but that's inevitably going to impact on the construction sector, and that will in turn hit upon the availability of contract compliant materials and products within projects. And I mentioned the CA system, which is coming in to replace the CE mark. I just posed the question there whether there is going to be mutual recognition. At the moment, that is unclear, and the industry is looking for guidance from Alok Sharma and his department as to what is going to happen post transition. In terms of materials and products, well, the UK is a net importer of materials, and so in order to keep the supply lines running, that is potentially a very major headache for UK construction projects, particularly with the growth of the just-in-time supply chains, getting the timing right for that. I know there are a number of project managers on this webinar, and I think this is going to be, good project management is going to be more important than ever in terms of enabling smooth running forward planning, sourcing of materials, and achieving price certainty, because inevitably there's likely to be a trade-off there. And then finally, in terms of the workforce, again, the UK is a net purchaser of overseas workforce. This is a very real concern in the wake of the vote in 2016. Not just for construction, but for other areas of the labour market. But as you can see there, approximately 14% of the UK construction labour force involves non-UK citizens. So plenty of opportunities. The question are the logistics of how that's going to work. Thanks, Luke. Can we move on, please? So there's the big question: are these risks going to be allocated, or are they going to be shared? So I'll come on to the next slide, and we'll just look at that very briefly. I will try and rattle through so we can leave some time for discussion. And the three main points are to look at time and cost and quality. That's common on any construction project. The clients are taking a harder line. I think they were doing that pre-COVID. I think with COVID having hit now and very that's focused attention in particular on the ability to resource projects, what it's going to do in terms of pushing out time on projects and programs falling by the wayside. But at the same time, we've got insurers who are taking a hard stand. So at some point, there's going to something is going to have to give. But inevitably, what's happening with Brexit is going to impact upon certainty of supply line. As I say, this all comes back to the question of project management. What we're seeing in negotiation is that there is not a huge amount of room for give and take, and it's leading to some quite robust negotiations on Brexit terms and on COVID terms. As I say, it is good news that this whole situation is opening up the way to new players coming into the market and backfill skills gaps and the like. But there may be a sort of a common struggle for resource in this. And I mentioned earlier, clients are going to have to look forward in terms of managing supply chains to see, well, who are the contractors and the specialists and the professionals that we want to build quality relationships with, because that may have the impact of moving the dial on pricing, which is always a bone of contention. Thanks, Luke. Can we have the next one, please? There is at the moment reduced output. I've simply put this up by way of an illustration because there is plenty of new work out there, but what we're seeing at the moment is it's mostly coming in the housing sector. Commercial and the stats on commercial are more up in the air. I think that will change. This is very much a sort of a transient phase that we're in, but house building is always going to remain strong, I think, for the foreseeable future. Demand is greatly outstripping supply, so yeah, plenty of opportunity. Thanks, Luke. I think we're coming to the end now. Yeah. So, what's the UK government's role? Well, a lot depends upon the next few days, really. I don't know if Anne has seen any updates. We may come on to that during the discussion. But the UK government is generally non-interventionist. We've seen a bit more intervention over the last 6 months with rules on site operating procedures, maintaining social distances. We've had legislative change coming in with the Corporate Insolvency Act, which came in June, which is making it, well, it's basically taking away the option of terminating contracts with insolvent employers. Now, that has a big effect, potentially, for suppliers, and looking at alternative routes so as not to keep on throwing good money after bad. And the Cabinet Office took quite an unusual step in issuing some guidance on how to approach disputes and to encourage businesses to take a much more collaborative approach. At the moment, it's way too early to tell, and whether this will extend into the post-transition world. I mean, this is guidance that was issued specifically in relation to COVID, but if you know, it's always been a bane of the construction industry's life, the degree to which matters can fall into dispute. I think we're all just waiting to see whether that's actually going to follow through into practice. I finally mention Mark Farmer's report. It is worth a quick read if anybody gets the opportunity. It's his report about Modernise or Die. It's all about trying to plug the skills gaps, bringing in, you know, sort of fresh talent, younger talent, a greater diversity and a mix of people coming into the construction sector. Because I think if we are able to get that right, it's going to benefit the industries in both countries greatly, but it's going to require some quite significant shifts in culture and approach and attitude. Thank you. I think that is the final slide. It is. Thank you. So Anne, back to you.
Yes, sorry, I'm just trying to get myself back on. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Richard. We do have some questions come in. If I can fire a couple of these questions at you both now. One of the questions is, will the UK have its own standards for building products, materials and machinery, or will it continue to observe EU regulations?
Thank you. I slightly stole your thunder on this, I think, because just in terms of touching on it briefly, the question about the bringing in of the UKCA system, which is intended to replace the CE mark. There is, I mentioned that the industry here is looking for guidance on that in terms of whether that is going to be the plan going forward. And as part of that guidance, I think what we're looking for is actually whether it's going to mean close alignment. I think when it was announced, the intention was that it was meant to be as seamless as possible to try and move from the CE mark into a consistent and complementary set of standards. It would be peculiar to move completely away from that, but of course there are wider forces at play in terms of how the UK is going to be aligned with other territories and you know, the opening up of possible lines of business there that is going to be less focused on what is brought about by the CE mark. I'm afraid I can't say anything other than we have to wait and see on that. But it's something that everybody needs to keep very firmly in mind as to whether there is going to be some sort of standardization and harmonization of those standards.
Do we think it's going to, they'll let us know before the 31st of December, or is it something that maybe everything will stay the same and it'll maybe happen the first sort of quarter of 2021? What's your predictions?
I'd love to have an accurate crystal ball to be able to tell. I think it's going to be, you know, what we've seen over the last few years is that the nature of the relationships are so hugely intertwined. You know, having worked as part of the EU for the last 45 years, you know, and anybody who thought, oh, well, you're just going to bring a guillotine down and it's just going to change overnight was deluding themselves. And I think, although yes, the legal position will be relatively clear cut in terms of what happens on the 1st of January in terms of the Withdrawal Act coming into force. But what we're talking about is trade, and discussions about trade continue to go on regardless of whether it's part of an arrangement with the EU or with other trade areas or other players around the world. I think inevitably it's going to be a sort of it's going to be a gradient.
Yeah, I think as well, there's a fear there, probably not a rational fear, that there's going to be some sort of drop in maintenance of standards, effectively. That is the concern from the EU perspective. However, as Richard has quite rightly pointed out, the UK has been a member of the EU for many years, and its standards are effectively on all fours. If there are to be changes in the future, my assessment or my prediction would be that it comes down to just simply competitiveness and being able to trade on an international stage in a different way. But in Ireland, we are acutely aware of standards, particularly following the Celtic dagger. There were, you know, during that period, major concerns over maintenance of standards, and that's now being corrected. But going forward, with the likes of the Construction Industry Register, which is focused very much on standards, it will be very important to ensure that the UK doesn't derogate too far away from the EU requirements.
I think it would cause a problem for the UK industry if it did, actually, as well. And I mean, it's why we're on tenterhooks at the moment to see whether there's going to be a deal or not. It's got to be in everybody's interests, you know, in the UK, dare I say it, for there to be a deal, so that we don't run the risk of losing that competitive element.
Another question is, in relation to Brexit clauses UK to Ireland and vice versa, would you describe the tone of these clauses generally, that all risk in delays or increased costs are passed to the subcontractors by main contractors, or are they more consolatory in spirit, resplitting?
My experience of them.
That's a mouthful of a question.
My experience of them has been that they've developed somewhat over the last few years. It's typically between an employer and a main contractor. That's where you see it in the first instance, and their sort of form is effectively relates to materials and delay risk for materials. So if there was a lot of discussion earlier in the year about structural steel potentially being an issue, and what you will find is that if, for example, something is delayed, which has an impact on the program for longer than a certain period of time, then the contractor carries the risk of that. So that's why it's so important that it's transferred downstream to the extent that's reasonably possible with subcontractors. Likewise, there's a similar incidence in terms of the cost increases that they're also applied if there's a cost increase as a result of a Brexit issue. I don't know about you, Richard, but that's the way we've seen it.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar. It's like all these things. Each project has to be looked at on its own terms, and you look at the dynamics of the relationship between client and contractor. It's quite interesting because you often see the same client taking different approaches on different projects depending on the nature of the project, the relationship with the contractor. I do see that there is going to be, because there is going to be this squeeze on resources and expertise, that the sensible clients are going to be the ones that are going to be interested in building sustainable relationships with their supply chains. Because I think not to do so and to be aggressive and to look to dump all the risk is ultimately not going to win not going to win many favours, and they're going to be hugely reliant on having those supply lines. So, you know, sort of a more collaborative approach, I think, is certainly one to be encouraged.
Absolutely.
Another question. It's sort of sorry, Jimmy, were you going to say something there?
No, I was just agreeing with Richard.
It's sort of similar question. It says that the UK government have granted emergency planning permission for transport lorry parks. I think this is in the UK. And if this causes significant delays in getting supplies to sites, who is responsible? Which is a good question, because is it the supplier, or is the contractor main contractor going to take the hit in terms of the developer or their client?
You're talking about the M20 car park in Kent,
yeah.
And the issue that with that internal border. It's all going to come down to what the contract says, really. If there are contracts in place now, we're seeing an interesting transition at the moment, because we're talking about a number of known risks. So the parties are able to look at that and how that's going to be allocated. Again, it comes down to what's the contractor prepared to live with, and how they're going to price it, as much as anything. Yeah.
It is going to be quite worrying for everyone if there are these 20-mile delays on the M25 getting stuff to sites. So it's another similar question. I think it's the last question that we have. It said the press are reporting that the Port of Dover is not Brexit ready, and the UK government is considering forcing drivers to obtain a special Brexit passport before entering Kent. Would that be true? Is that anything that is there? Should we believe the press that all the companies now need to get their transport companies a special passport?
We could run a whole separate seminar, I think, on whether we should believe the press. I think, sorry, Jamie, I was just going to jump in, because I think there is a degree to which the some stories are getting overblown, and it's all going to be a disaster, and this is what's going to happen. There may be an element of that, and I think there's likely to be some impact, and if it hasn't been otherwise sorted out in contracts in terms of supply lines, usually you would expect the contractors are going to be at risk on that, but it will very much depend. I don't know the position on the ground in Dover, other than what I read in the press. I always take that with a pinch of salt, but inevitably there's concern that it may not be as ready as you'd like it to be.
Okay. I think we're sort of running out of time, unfortunately. But let me conclude this by saying a massive thank you, Jamie and Richard. Thank you very much for your insights. Thank you very much for your time. It's much appreciated. And thank you to everyone who has joined today. I hope you've all got some insights, and it's made us all much more informed. If anyone wants to connect to learn more about the Irish supply chain, or a connection to the Irish supply chain, please do get in touch. Or if you want to contact Jamie or Richard directly, the details are up on the screen now. So all I can say now is thanks again, thanks a million, and take care and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. All the best.
Thanks, Anne. Bye-bye.
Thank you.